Hey everybody, thanks for joining. Just going to give it a couple minutes here for folks to filter in, and then we will kick things off. And while we're giving folks a minute here, we'd love to hear where people are calling on in from in the chat. Joel and I are on opposite ends on of the country here, over in Boston, and you're in Arizona, right, Joel?
Yes, that's right.
Nice. We got Salt Lake City. I'm jealous of your location, Andrew. Joel and I have been talking a little bit about how it's been kind of a crappy snowboarding winter here out east. Hey, Tom.
No winter this year. Oh man.
Well, now apparently it's going to snow in the mountains, but I'm leaving for Puerto Rico to go on vacation the day before. So that's just how these things tend to work out sometimes. All right, so I guess we can kick it off here. So yeah, super excited to be joined by Joel Polanco. Today we're going to be talking about understanding the value of new user acquisition versus retention. So Joel will take us through a bit of a just basic growth overview, explain some case studies around companies that have done a really good job in each of these areas, and then also we'll have time at the end of the webinar for Q&A. So if you do have questions, feel free to type them in the chat throughout or hang on to them until the end for the Q&A section. And then we will be recording the webinar as well. So no need to write everything down. We'll share a copy of the recording after the event in case anyone wants to look back or pass this along to a colleague. But with that, I will pass it over to Joel to get us started.
All right, thank you, Will. Let me share my screen here. Okay, hopefully you can see that on your end.
Looks good.
Great. All right, let's get started. Cool. So thank you for joining us today. My name is Joel Polanco. As you can see, I'm from Intel. I'm a segment lead in the network and edge group on our industry team. I've been with Intel for 18 years now. I actually started out as a process engineer, and so process engineers are the folks inside the fab. And a fab is a big manufacturing facility that makes chips, and that's what we do at Intel. So that's where I started. I've also been in marketing, sales, operations, and product, and so I've had kind of a wide range of experiences, and that's really helped me in my product management career a ton. Products that I worked on, so mainly B2B at Intel, in the Internet of Things space, some AI, not a ton of AI, but some AI, and then retail and hardware and software platforms. Outside of work, as Will mentioned, I live in Arizona, so sunny Arizona. I love the sun. Originally from Chicago, love Chicago, but can't say I'm a big fan of the weather any longer. And yeah, outside of work, I have one son, wife and son, and I love startup advising. So it's something I do on the side, and a little bit of investing. Okay, so for agenda for today, so we're going to talk about growth, and we'll talk about the fundamentals of growth. I'll go into the basics of growth marketing, and we'll talk about acquisition, engagement, and retention. As Will mentioned, I'll talk about some examples with each of those. And then really we'll get to the crux of the conversation, which is around comparing acquisition versus retention, and kind of how you value that, like, how you compare the two, how I think about it, and some of the things that you want to consider as you focus in on your teams with these two fundamentals. and then I'll talk about dun 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 the silent killer. Okay, so let's get started. The basics of growth. The basics of growth, it's very straightforward, but to just recap on it, it is you're acquiring your users through acquisition, you're engaging your users through engagement, and then you're retaining your users through retention. And so each of these work in conjunction with other, and then in some cases, which we'll go over through examples, one can actually feed one another. So it's not that they're all separate, and we try to show that here in a Venn diagram, is that they can overlap one another, and you want to think about them in conjunction with one another rather than thinking of them as separate fundamentals or elements of your growth strategy. They do come together. Acquisition. So this is my first hot take is I would argue that this is the most popular growth, element or fundamental. I think most teams tend to gravitate towards this, maybe put a little bit too much emphasis on this. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, but nonetheless, acquisition is super important. This is where you are trying to increase your user count. And so early on, say if you're in an early stage startup, a big focus is going to be around acquiring new users. No surprise, because you don't have any yet. Later on, as your product moves into more maturity, you're going to focus on other things. But early on, obviously you're going to focus on acquisition. And the other part of this is like another fun area of this is because you directly affect your user count early on, especially if you're starting from zero. Folks that have funding and can run paid campaigns, you see like immediate results in a lot of cases. So you just see the user count increase. And if you're just measuring yourself on that, then you start to see your metrics shift significantly. Another point here though is like if you're a B2B space, for those in the B2C, a lot of times your users are your customers, but in the B2B space, your users are not necessarily your customers. So in spite of the fact that you maybe have just run a paid campaign and have acquired a lot of users, you'll still need to do a lot of work in order to convert those users over to paying customers. And so you'll start to see, or you've probably seen a lot of topics or discussion around strategies like product-led growth. And so this is the case where you're leveraging your product. The idea is your product is self-service, and so then early on, a user gets introduced to your product, and there's no sales required. And so in the B2B space, this is a big deal because as you add salespeople, your costs start to increase significantly. And so, you really want to focus your sales team on high value, high dollar, high probability opportunities, as opposed to, getting a single user from a large company and then kind of throwing a dart and hoping that user at a large company results in a large sale. And so if you're interested in, say, like product-led growth or product-led sales, one recommendation I have is to follow Elena Verna on LinkedIn. Great follow, a lot of great content about this topic. So if you're interested in learning more about product-led growth, definitely follow Elena. My last bullet here is about ZIRP. So ZIRP, if you're not familiar with ZIRP, stands for Zero Interest Rate Policy. And so if you've been in tech, like for the last 10 years, you know that interest rates have been like near zero, were near zero for quite a long time, like over a decade. And that's kind of unheard of long term. And so what did that result in? That resulted in basically, it did not cost, the cost of capital or the cost to acquire users was very insignificant because interest rates were so low. And in that environment, you could argue that no ideas are bad ideas. And so during ZIRP, a lot of ex-growth companies were able to fund a lot of user acquisition through open wallet VC funding. And so in 2022, a couple of years ago, when interest rates went to 5%, we start to see a lot of those companies actually having a tough time continuing their growth, right? They relied on their growth for revenue and for their next funding rounds. And as interest rates climbed up, they began to have a difficult time. And that's resulted in a lot of challenges in tech, layoffs, funding cuts, years of efficiency, these sorts of things. And so acquisition actually becomes a lot more difficult when your paid budget starts to go down. You need to rely on other growth tactics. So an interesting case study I put together. This is probably my favorite example of acquisition, which is Uber. And I say that because Uber is a two-sided marketplace. You begin to read into it. If you haven't read into Uber's story, I highly recommend it. I even think there's like a mini series on Showtime coming out about it. Really interesting. If you move all the controversy around Uber aside, and you just look kind of at the growth side of their business and how they grew that business, you uncover a lot of things. One is they built this two-sided marketplace, of drivers and riders. So your supply is the drivers, your demand is the riders. And so you had to actually acquire both drivers and riders to build this marketplace. And they both had network effects associated with them. And so here on the right, I show an example of the supply side or the driver side where Uber's trying to recruit drivers for a city. They send out these postcards. I found an example of one on the internet where in order for Uber to really get a market going, they had to move city by city. So they had to be very strategic. They had to staff regional operations teams in each city. And then they had to first acquire drivers because you can't acquire riders unless you have supply to supply those riders. You need cars, you need folks, you need a ride share, and they need to be available. And so Uber had to spend lots of money in order to fund the driver side of the network in each of the cities first, in order to have enough drivers. So when you a rider would open up the app, there was a driver available for you to catch, and that allows a market to be built up and to eventually stabilize. And so with that, you have supply, you have demand, you have different pricing. And so one of the things, as you look deeper into this is that Uber spent a lot of time, as I mentioned, building up city by city. They were very fortunate in that they were able to do this during the ZIRP period that I spoke about on the prior slide. And they've now actually, after many years, finally turned a profit. And that's taken them quite a long time to do. But as it turns out, they do have a profitable business. Again, if you have more interest in looking into the Uber story and the Uber growth story, I highly recommend the Cold Start Problem by Andrew Chen. Andrew Chen is a partner over at Andreessen Horowitz, and he wrote a book on his time at Uber when he was the head of rider growth, and just a lot of interesting nuggets on how he thinks about growth and how he applied those thoughts into the real world. Okay. Engagement. So engagement, not going to talk a ton about engagement today, but just at a high level, this is usage. This is the usage of your product. The idea here is your product does something for someone. It helps me do X better. It can help me understand Y better. It entertains me. It inspires me to build Z. Whatever it is, your product engages an audience and it fulfills a job to be done for them. And so in the end, to drive more engagement, you either need to find more audience, so you need to acquire more users, or you need to drive more usage. And so that's what engagement is all about. So you want to do that in different ways, but one way is to drive new features. Top level measures here are really important. So selecting your top level measure is really based upon your usage frequency, typically. So in a lot of apps, in a lot of software companies, their top level metrics are things like daily active users or monthly active users. These are metrics like an X, Twitter, or Facebook would look at. But ultimately, for your product, you need to determine what your usage measure is based on your frequency. And then in the end, it'll take me to my next topic, which is no engagement means no retention. So you might have acquired these users. They might have tried something out. Maybe they tried it out for a little bit, they didn't get it, or it wasn't fulfilling their job to be done. So you weren't able to retain them, and so that's bad. And hence why you don't want to just focus only on acquisition. If we look at engagement, one of my favorite examples is LinkedIn. So I just put together a few, examples of things that LinkedIn has added over the years to drive engagement. They are driving tons of engagement, always looking at different services, different features, whether it's to people's personal sites, whether it's to people's feeds, whether it's new products, whether it's for businesses and not necessarily individuals, and services for different categories of people. So, services being like premium career for folks focused on their individual career, or recruiters, or sales individuals looking to do prospecting. LinkedIn, just is fulfilling a number of jobs to be done, and I highlight a few of them here. And this is not all encompassing either. So pretty impressive, in my opinion, what LinkedIn's been able to do over the years. Okay, retention. So retention, really, really simple. Being able to retain users. Things here that are really important are things like your churn rate. This would be one measure of retention. This is something like the Verizons and the AT&Ts of the world look at in terms of their customers. How many customers are churning every month. Moving between companies, between AT&T, Verizon, or T-Mobile. Cable companies are doing this as well. So this is a percentage, churn rate being the percentage of users or customers that you lost over a period. A direct correlation, as I mentioned, between engagement and retention is the positive change in engagement rates reflect generally a higher retention. There are other ways to measure retention as well. A lot of SaaS companies will measure net revenue retention. So this is the amount of dollars a customer spends with you, and they look at how much of those dollars continue to be spent over a period, and if that number is increasing. So as you develop new products or new features, are those being purchased, and is an individual customer purchasing more? Retention case study. So I picked Slack. So I'm a big fan of Slack. I like the product. This is a case of, just a fantastic case of network effects in action. Usage drives more usage. So I remember the first time that I got invited to Slack, it was through our developer team one of our developer teams at Intel. I had just learned about Slack, like, hey, what's this thing? Oh, this is where you're gonna communicate with us on different issues, and at the time there wasn't really great instant messaging, and I love this product. Once I got in, it was like my go-to. And so this is a great example of word of mouth, or if you want to communicate with our group, you get invited, and then then in return want to invite more people, because the network gets bigger, and as the network gets bigger, you can communicate more, and so that usage drives more usage. There's great Slack retention stories out on the web, and one of the things that I took away is with retention in particular is the product market fit. So retention is actually a great indicator, a direct correlation to your product market fit. As you retain more users, you know that you're hitting your product market fit. And so as I talk about this, I started looking at I started thinking about, okay, other uses Slack is used for rather than just my own use case. And one of them that I found here was from a startup, branch.io. And the co-founder had actually written this article, and they talked about how they use Slack. So this is, again, the great word of mouth. They talked about how they use Slack for setting up channels with their customers. And so in those channels, their team is able to directly communicate with their customers, each of their customers. In those channels, they identify new features. They perform customer support for questions and issues. They perform customer service. And so, on top of just using Slack with your own team, Slack gets used in a number of other ways. And this is just one example. Another example would be, like, say, through communities. And so I like these two examples here because it really just reinforces the word of mouth aspect and how that plays out, and how retention can actually lead to acquisition. If more usage drives more word of mouth, then that can hopefully help you decrease your acquisition spend if your product is, you retain a customer on your product and they tell others about it. That's one of the still the most powerful tools of marketing.
Joel, while we're on the Slack example, I have a question for you. It does
Sure.
definitely feel like they were one of the early pioneers of the product-led growth motion. And it seems like a lot of people seem to think that in order to be product led, you essentially have to be touchless or, lack essentially human to human communication. And it feels like in some cases that might be taken a little bit too far, to the point where it leads to missed opportunities. So I'm just curious if you see that and how you think companies should approach that trade-off between flexibility while also making sure we have the right level of communication and support to drive engagement and retention.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think, if you go back a couple of years, there was like this really strong debate around that topic, and people are getting on sides. And as the kind of the debate continued, it started to go into it started to evolve where, as I mentioned, Elena Berna is a great follow on LinkedIn about this topic, and she talks about the future of product-led growth moving towards product-led sales. And I think that makes a lot of sense because it's not about eliminating the sales function. That's absolutely not what you do not want to think about it that way. That's not a way to think about this, but rather it's how can we provide the data, the intent data, the usage data, what are those key elements in the product and signals that help us prioritize opportunities for sales to go after. And so, it's really about the growth team and your sales team working together, establishing a framework that works for your company or your product, and doing the due diligence, really understanding the usage data, what are those signals from a user that says, hey, someone's ready, they're raising their hand, I'm ready, I'd like to talk to sales. And so, if you can do those things really well, it leads to great efficiency. And as I talk about it, you can just imagine a growth team being really happy and a sales team being really happy when you can find that sweet spot for your product. Did I answer that, Will?
I think so, yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so the crux of the presentation here. So, comparing acquisition versus retention. Two key points. One is the value. So what's the value of acquisition versus retention? And the value depends on timing. And the other key point is, this debate around customer acquisition costs. And I think that piece we'll set aside for now. Just we'll talk about the value depends on timing. So, in short, in general, if you have an early product or early new feature on a platform product, you're going to be focused on you're going to be focused on acquisition most likely. You don't have users yet, and so the value of acquisition and focusing on acquisition is going to be a lot higher. As your product matures and as you go through your growth phase, you're going to be focused more on engagement and retention, and those two feed one another. And you will not have a viable business long term without retaining your users. You can't be acquiring new users endlessly. You need to retain on some level. Now, the second point is the customer acquisition. So CAC to LTV ratio versus the ROI debate. And so you'll see if you dive into this even a little bit, you'll see a lot of folks debating this, CAC versus LTV, the flaws, so CAC being your customer acquisition cost, how much did you spend to acquire a customer or a user? The LTV being the long-term customer value. And then the ROI here, the return on investment or the time to pay back that cost. And so what's the debate? The debate here is that you don't know your long-term customer value. You can estimate it, but the idea is you want to have a positive long-term value. You don't want to be spending more to acquire a customer than the value the customer is going to spend with you over the long term. Simple as that. And so I think the big debate is like, okay, well, if we don't know the long-term value and CAC to LTV is flawed, then what do we do? Well, ROI is another way to measure it. And the way you measure ROI here is by saying we're going to spend X amount of dollars to acquire a customer. We have this data over time that we've been mapping out, and we need to estimate how long is it going to take to recoup that money that we spent to acquire the customer. And that's your time to pay back. And you want to have a time to pay back that works for your business, whether it's 6, 12, 18 months, because you know that as you're trying to grow your company, you're going to need to have a cash flow, and it needs to be positive over time so you can continue to acquire more customers at a reasonable cost. And so in the end, I think that no matter what you do, no matter how you measure this, that you can't be spending more to acquire a customer than the value you're going to get. So here's a couple of examples if we compare like new user acquisition versus a retention. And I picked out Uber and Slack and in this little table. And so we can just walk through and think about some of the different aspects of acquisition and retention for these two companies. And so, for Uber, we'll start with Uber. A big part of their business is the supply side, as I mentioned, so the drivers. And you can imagine they have some churn of drivers. So they have they have retention, some level of retention of drivers, but they have a lot of churn. And so new user acquisition is how do we continue to identify new potential drivers for the platform. And so they have to continue new user acquisition for drivers. Whereas I think on the rider side, most people are aware of Uber. It's Uber or Lyft, and a lot of people have both of those apps on their phone as riders. You might even compare fares before you take a ride share. But with drivers, there's a different kind of challenge, which is trying to encourage drivers to join and consider their business as opposed to say driving for DoorDash or some other company. On the retention side, Uber's looking at how do we retain these drivers? How do we keep them happy? What sort of incentive plans do we need to have in place? How can we improve the lives of drivers? They can have tough jobs at times, and so how can we improve their satisfaction? And they do a lot of this through UX, actually. So the Uber's like a really big focus on their user experience, and that applies to both drivers and riders. And they want to make things as easy as possible and make sure that they have clear communications with their drivers to help improve their driver satisfaction. On the rider side for retention, it's also the similar things, offering benefits, discounts, and rewards. And so, they also want to retain people on the platform in the case where you're a long-term rider. So, maybe you don't have a car, but you need a ride on a daily basis, or semi daily. Making sure that those plans are in place so that we can retain you as a long-term customer, because we know that you are going to be riding multiple times a week or even a day. So if we move to Slack and we look at new user acquisition and retention, if we look at focus on new user acquisition, one thing here is there's a big debate around Slack versus Teams, and typically you'll see this famous graph that's out there, which shows like Slack growth, and it kind of tops off, whereas Teams just kind of did the hockey stick and blew up. And so that's the number of users on Teams is just so much more dramatic. I think there's two ways to look at that. One is, the reality is they are competing with one another, but in a lot of cases they're not. They're actually they're both used in a lot of companies. I know in my company they're both used. And they kind of cater to different audiences in a lot of cases. So, Slack kind of leaning towards a tech company's preference, and so this gets into the aspect of, the more users isn't always the only metric that you should look at. If you have really high retention, yes, maybe on a smaller user base, I wouldn't call that not successful. If you have a smaller user base with high retention, you just have a different audience, and so the reality is you might focus on other things. And so, with Slack, has a tendency to lean towards startups, Teams more towards large companies. So kind of two different buckets of customers there, very different needs. And then the other piece is, because startups tend to prefer Slack, this actually turns into a growth driver for Salesforce.com. So Salesforce.com being the umbrella company that owns Slack and other products, including the Salesforce CRM, Slack can turn into a growth driver for Salesforce.com as new companies come in. They're using Slack. Does that, you have to think that helps improve their likelihood of using other Salesforce products long term. And so that puts Salesforce in a great competitive position for the markets that they serve. And so it can turn into new users, new customers for Salesforce as a whole, because of Slack's really strong presence in the startup community. For Slack retention, I think one of my favorite example was the one that I provided earlier under the retention example, which was the customer focused content. A customer produced, a co-founder from a startup produced this really nice article, how we use Slack to service customers, through customer support, customer service, and just having these open channels with them, and the customers like it. And so with that, that helps form a retention strategy around content, which shows other customers success stories, or it builds this community of, hey, this is how we use Slack, and it helps retain other customers because they see how the platform is being used. Okay, so I have to hammer this point home. This is the other thing here is um, as I mentioned, my hot take. I feel like teams tend to gravitate towards acquisition, and retention doesn't get the time and attention that it deserves. And so I'm just going to stress here, like, it is the silent killer. This is a concept that Brian Balfour really instilled in my thoughts when I read his blog, and I went through several Reforge programs, which I highly recommend. He spoke a lot about retention, and I cannot hammer home how important it is. It is a direct representation of your product market fit, and there's a lot of interesting articles on that. Paid acquisition will eventually run out. You'll hit some home runs there, but if you spend that time up front acquiring those users and they're not engaged, you are not going to retain them. And so it's really important having that your product and your growth teams have a really good understanding of what's driving engagement and how you can do more of it, and what are those other things that you need to be looking at in order to drive more engagement on the platform. So when you run your next paid acquisition campaign on a new feature or a new type of user, you're prepared to figure out how you'll retain them on the platform. Awesome. Well, I'm going to pause here, and I think we have a quick message from the sponsor today, LogRocket. So I'll turn it over to Will.
Yeah, thanks, Joel. So yeah, I think as we've heard today, there's a lot of different factors that can influence your ability to acquire and retain new customers. Not all of them are in our control, but something that we can focus on is making sure that our product experience is as flawless and streamlined as possible. So that's why we're excited to announce the launch of LogRocket's new AI-powered solution, Galileo. We actually started out 5 or 6 years ago, mostly as a session replay provider. So essentially, our software would capture videos of users interacting with your web and mobile applications. And you could then, look at those and see where people getting stuck, maybe in an in-app onboarding flow, identify some bugs that might be preventing users from signing up and becoming a paid customer. On the other hand, maybe you'll identify some issues that are common frustration points that contribute to churn because people aren't able to actually achieve the objective that they sought to achieve by using your product. And so, what Galileo does is essentially leverage machine learning to scan hundreds of thousands or even millions of session replay recordings to automatically identify the most impactful usability and technical issues in your web and mobile applications. So gone are the days of needing to watch hundreds or thousands of sessions to find something interesting that you can then action to build a better product. Galileo will do that for you. And we like to say it's like having a dedicated product analyst on your team. So if anyone's interested in checking that out, I know we do have a few customers on the call already. We'll follow up with some more information after the webinar. But yeah, that's all for the plug. And then I think we were going to open it up to Q&A before we wrap up here. So would love to hear questions from the crowd. I also actually have one, Joel, that came to mind. So it seems like with this move to kind of a higher interest rate policy, it really makes it more important to be focusing on retention. It's expensive to acquire users. Where do you think that teams can invest for the maximum impact to boost retention? Is it equipping customer success teams? Is it improving product? Like, what are the few things that you would recommend everyone do to try to boost retention and engagement?
Yeah, I think it's not any one thing or one that stands to mind, because it's really dependent on your business, on your product. You know your product better than anyone else. All the things that you mentioned will be aspects that go into improving retention. Ultimately, depending on your business, you may be looking at things like I mentioned, net revenue retention and you know improving that metric uh, is done in a number of ways. It could be through better customer support. It could be through identifying better customer experience. It kind of depends on the state of your product, but in the end, hopefully you're identifying ways to improve your net revenue retention over the percentage it's at today. So, if you're at 100, can you get to 110? Can you improve the amount of revenue existing customers are spending with you? And it really depends, I guess, is kind of what I'd say, which isn't the greatest answer. I know we're looking for uh, a silver bullet, but it could be that missing feature that you've been thinking about, but haven't quite scripted into a strategy yet, and haven't figured out how to monetize. One interesting story that I read was from Sachin Ricky. Was a founder for NoteJoy, his startup, and he was a former PM at LinkedIn, and he talked about kind of the process he went through to create Sales Navigator. And I think you can find that online. That's a great example of identifying an opportunity, this set of users that is not serviced today, and you built this product inside an existing platform. You leverage your platform, LinkedIn, to create a new product, and you're able to monetize that. That's a fantastic example because all those people were already using the platform. They just weren't. They just didn't have a service or a premium service targeted for them, and so there's really a multitude of answers to this.
Nice. Awesome to hear you reference Sachin. I actually cited his work in a webinar we ran last year about user friction. And he
Mm,
actually came up with this framework he called it the hierarchy of user friction, which was pretty interesting. There's actually a few different flavors, but that's a topic for another day, I guess. But definitely puts out some good content.
for sure. Yeah, definitely recommend it. Just take a look at his site. Very helpful.
Cool.
Cool.
Well, I think we are right up about on time here. So, unless there are any other questions, I think we can probably wrap it up. Thanks again, Joel, for hosting. I found it really informative. I'm sure the rest of the crowd here did as well. And yeah, hope everyone is excited to check out Log Rocket Galileo. If not, that's also cool. But we will be in touch. And thanks again, everyone, for joining.
Yeah, thank you. Stay in touch.
Thanks. See you guys.